This video is brought to you by BetterHelp. When I was a teenager, the only thing adults were more obsessed with than the Bush family was making sure that none of us engaged in, I guess, premature, premarital, romantic expressions. So it's now kind of funny to me that these days we're more likely to hear about young people keeping it in their pants. Then there's the never-ending internet discourse, popular on Twitter or X or whatever that guy calls it, about the pros, the cons, and even the dangers of erotic scenes, which are derided as gratuitous and excessive. So what's going on when young people and aging conservatives agree that on-screen sex has got to go? Why does watching people bone down in 4K make us uncomfortable? And what does this squeamishness say about both us and our society? We're going to explore it in this video. Why are we afraid of sex on screen? Being squirmy about sex in cinema is an American tradition that kicked off in 1896 with cinema's first love scene. Yeah, this on-screen kiss caused immense backlash and calls for censorship. However, early filmmakers embraced the truism that sex sells and capitalized on the era's sexual anxieties. As calls for censorship escalated, the film industry organized, promising to regulate itself. This led to the Will H. Hays Code, which decreed that film should uphold the moral standards of its audience and protect the sanctity of marriage and the home. By the mid-1930s, everything from suggestive dances to superfluous use of liquor to ridicule of religion essentially disappeared on screen. So did sexual desire outside of marriage, adultery, depiction of mixed-race relationships, and queerness. Now, the code relied on industry compliance, so the rules were often stretched. Filmmakers found sneaky ways to inject eroticism, arguing that it added value to the plot.
Well, speaking of horses, I like to play them myself. But I like to see them work out a little first. See if they're front runners or come from behind.
Okay, before it gets any steamier, we want to take a second to thank this video's sponsor, BetterHelp. Now, if you've experienced anxiety or depression or just felt kind of overwhelmed, BetterHelp is a resource that can help you feel better. And BetterHelp's network of more than 30,000 therapists are ready to listen to and help you. Now, after you take a brief questionnaire, you'll be matched with a therapist whose expertise fits your unique needs. And thanks to BetterHelp's remote model, you can work with a therapist whose skills might not otherwise be available in your area. Now, you can message your therapist anytime and you'll receive timely and thoughtful responses. Plus, you get to schedule your choice of either phone or video sessions to receive counseling in real time. And honestly, there's nothing better than finding a therapist that you feel good with, that is an expert in the area you need, and that can really help you. And I know personally, therapy has been a big part of my life as an adult. It's really helped me deal with my depression and ADHD, and I've been lucky to find therapists that are great, that I like a lot. And in the event that you and your therapist aren't a perfect match, that's okay, because you can just easily switch to a new one for no additional charge. So join the more than 2 million people who have taken charge of their mental health with BetterHelp by visiting BetterHelp.com/Wisecrack, or just click the link in the video description. Now, when you do that, you'll get 10% off your first month. That is BetterHelp.com/Wisecrack. And now, let's get back to the show. Then in the mid to late 40s, as Hollywood studios lost their monopoly and thereby regulating power over film distribution, the Hays Code started to crack. Struggling to compete with television, studios enticed viewers with adults-only fare and erotic foreign films, which made American content look like Bluey. And early to mid-60s cinema put the final nail in the Hays coffin. Even the Supreme Court argued that obscenity was justifiable if it contained redeeming social importance. Now, the industry pivoted to an early iteration of the rating system to restrict racier content to adult audiences. New Hollywood cinema reflected the era's sexual revolution, with themes ranging from open marriages to queer love. But still, actual sex was mostly just implied, or scenes skipped from the before to the after. Meanwhile, porno chic came out of the shadows. These twin revolutions peaked in 1972 when both Deep Throat and Last Tango in Paris captivated the nation. Another thing Last Tango in Paris and Deep Throat have in common is that both treated their actresses like absolute garbage. But by the mid-70s, changes like new tax laws discouraging corporate risk-taking and the rising expense of filmmaking made experimental Hollywood films risky. and sexless family blockbusters enticing, and not for the last time. Simultaneously, the rise of the conservative moral majority that would dominate 80s politics portended badly for racy cinema. Nonetheless, scholar Jody Pennington writes, even as the liberal 1970s were ending and a more conservative era dawning, sex remained significant in American life and in American cinema. Sex in film had been mainstreamed. Since the 80s, cinematic sexuality, outside of independent cinema at least, has followed some pretty unprovocative norms that emphasize sex as the province of committed, monogamous relationships and avoid anything too explicit. New ways to consume content at home, ranging from direct-to-TV films and cable stations, allowed Americans to scratch that horny itch via erotic thrillers and sexy sitcoms without even leaving the house. Okay, so on-screen sexuality has always been a tug of war. But while yesteryear's enemies of cinematic sex were stodgy old folks, militant religious figures, and concerned mothers, today they are, well, they're those exact same people, but they're also young people on TikTok who were born after 9/11. And we can try to understand this by re-examining the 80s backlash to the sexual revolution, which, as scholar Casey Ryan Kelly explains, involved the religious fundamentalist, conservative moral majority reappropriating second-wave feminism to fit their agenda. See, from the 60s on, second-wave feminism exposed sexism everywhere from the bedroom to the boardroom to Congress. Eventually, some theorists even argued that sex, especially sex outside monogamous relationships, was oppressive towards women, an idea that conservatives ran with hard. Kelly even argues that backlash is an insufficient signifier for the conservative cultural response to women's liberation and the sexual revolution. The term cannot fully describe how from the 1980s onward, neoconservatives domesticated, mainstreamed, and co-opted feminism as a defense of their principles. The result was blatant sex negativity, what the American Psychological Association defines as a negative attitude or stance toward any sexual behavior other than procreative marital coitus. Narratives valorizing sexual purity became increasingly prevalent, and as fears surrounding sex intensified with the AIDS crisis, even rom-coms lost any shred of implied adult sexuality. In the Bush years, which were ironically not sexy years, as billions were invested in abstinence-only sex education, purity till marriage was the name of the game.
Don't have sex, because you will get pregnant and die.
Exemplified by Twilight, where a vampire resisting the urge to suck blood is replaced with one who can't bang until he puts a ring on it. Now, today, the harms of sexual violence and imbalances of sexual power are widely discussed. We've learned that many edgy sex scenes and provocative hits, like Blue is the Warmest Color, involved the real-life mistreatment and abuse of actors. And these revelations have been the impetus for change. Intimacy coordinators now create safe environments for actors on mainstream sets. Sensitivity readers at studios screen scripts for sexual objectification, and so on, which could make this a huge opportunity for Hollywood to do better. But even as the film industry arguably becomes safer for performers in sex scenes, it becomes less friendly to portraying cinematic sex for a fairly predictable and boring reason, the same one we saw in the 70s, money. See, for most of Hollywood history, the appeal of a mainstream film was largely based around its stars, which meant mid-budget movies with big names reaped respectable financial rewards. And we loved seeing smoldering sensuality between our A-list leads. But with cinema going on the decline and the new accessibility of racier television, studios have pivoted from taking risks on steamy flicks to generating safer, big-budget franchise IP. As author and professor Shauna Kidman explains, especially post-COVID, movies run in theaters for less time before they hit streaming, so they need to have a quick box office return. You can't have an R-rated movie open at that size. Further, studios live and die by their ability to appeal to foreign markets, particularly China, and it's easier to avoid sex than to worry about potential censorship. Thus, even if we wanted to see more skin at the movies, it's just simply not profitable for studios. And the result is pretty glaring. Only 1.21% of movies released between 2010 and 2019 had any depictions of sex, a decline of 32% since just 1990. But despite cinema's recent tameness, I regularly hear folks all but calling for a new type of Hays Code. As scholars Lindsay Coleman and Carol Siegel wrote in 2018, the recent controversy seems to follow the old censorship criteria in that critics look for redeeming social value, as if sexual material must always be redeemed from some otherwise fallen or criminal state, lest it be seen as gratuitous or sexist. This not only harkens back to the belief that film needs to uphold our morals, but also manifests in the argument that sex scenes don't move the plot forward and are therefore a waste of time. Which of course then raises the question, what is the job of a movie in the first place? Now some of you might be saying to convey a story or plot, and this implies that its value is defined by a cogent series of on-screen events. But if you talk to any screenwriter, filmmaker, or a good film critic, they'll tell you that there's a lot more happening. As Roger Ebert put it, a movie is not about what it is about. It is about how it is about it. That is to say, the plot is not the be-all and end-all. It's about how the plot is conveyed through dialogue, cinematography, editing, and other aspects of filmmaking. For example, if you judged movies solely by their plots, you would have to maybe say that Avatar and Ferngully are identical in quality, which is ridiculous since I can't read this. The writer of the script, who's a genius, wants me to say that Ferngully is clearly a superior film, and I'm not doing it. I think Avatar is better, so let us know in the comments. Avatar and Ferngully. As screenwriter Rick Barristow argues, let's keep the story in perspective as just one element of a film, like the aspect ratio or the way it uses or does not use color. He explains that plot is sometimes simply less important than the character development, and that the best stories are character-driven. Experiencing narrative art is different from reading a hard news article, where the clarity and precision of plot or what happened and in what order is primary. In movies, what happens plot-wise really only matters to the viewer if there's emotional identification with the character. And to relate, you have to understand the character, which sex scenes undoubtedly help with. How someone has sex, who they have sex with, what they do before, during, and after sex, all can supply crucial information. So a sex scene that doesn't explicitly drive a plot forward still affects our interpretation of a film. Besides, sex it's kind of all around us, right? It's still everywhere, right? It's visible in plastic surgery culture, or on dating apps, which make hooking up easier than ordering Uber Eats, or in photo editing apps that emphasize our feminine or masculine assets. Well, it's important here to distinguish between sexualization and sexuality. Now, sexualization is about being the object of another's erotic pleasure. Sexuality is about having subjectivity in your sexual desires, modes of expression, and so on. And today, we're all looking like objects. As writer R.S. Benedict argues, a body is no longer a holistic system. It is not the vehicle through which we experience joy and pleasure. It is not a home to live in and be happy. It, too, is a collection of features. And these features exist not to make our lives more comfortable, but to increase the value of our assets. She goes on to argue that even as Hollywood stars cultivate physical perfection with more discipline than ever before, they increasingly don't have, or even desire, sex. The message seems to be, it's important to be sexually appealing for your career, your love life, your social status, but if you openly desire, much less do sex with your kick-ass bod, well, then the ghost of Will H. Hayes is gonna curse your boner forever. And listen, lest we sound dismissive of some young people's distaste for sex on screen, there are actually completely valid reasons to just be a little squicked out by it all. Now, while increasingly shows like The Deuce, Minx, and The Righteous Gemstones gleefully embrace screen peen, sex scenes still often cater to the straight male gaze, which largely means lots of idealized, objectifying female nudity and sex that finishes when the dude does. Perhaps worse, sexual assault is still frequently used as a shortcut for character development, whether it's Game of Thrones or Sam Levinson and The Weeknd's really bad show The Idol, or the brutal fictionalized Marilyn Monroe biopic Blonde. So maybe a big reason some folks don't really dig on-screen sex is because the sex being depicted isn't really for, or is even actively antagonistic towards them. And that's totally fair. But the thing is, when sex depicts limited experiences or disappears from media altogether, it has profound consequences for society. Media has always defined our conceptions of sex, romance, and love. As sociologist Mike Featherstone writes, the history of love is also the history of a literary genre. All the great changes in love correspond to shifts in literary movements, which both reflected on the different forms love could take and converted them into high ideals. For example, the emergence of romantic love in 12th century France was inextricable from the development of provincial poetry, which valorized courtly romance. Similarly, the reemergence of romantic literature in the 18th and 19th centuries, according to Featherstone, became socially important by helping to provide codes between men and women, especially in the increasingly urbanized world of strangers. The growing democratization of love also saw love as increasingly linked to sexuality and saw both becoming central to marriage. In other words, popular media of any era profoundly affects the way people think about and even live out romance, sex, and love. But in the Western world since the 18th century, sexuality has increasingly been seen less through the lens of art and love, and more through science. Foucault writes extensively about the medicalization of sexuality, which he believed confines human identity. As Featherstone describes, sexuality became seen as natural, inborn, and permanent, as sexual acts and desires became involuntary manifestations of a particular biological or psychological cause. In other words, sex was reduced to a medicalized process in which our organs do embarrassing stuff. However, Foucault also believed that positive depictions of the erotic in art could expand our notions of sexuality beyond cold and personal science. But today, as depictions of sexuality on the big screen become less common, pornography's accessibility has made it our prime medium for consuming sexual content. As film scholar Linda Williams argues, rather disparagingly, sex is too important to be left to the pornographers. Now, we are not here to debate the ethics of pornography, and YouTube, sadly, won't let us, show you enough porn to talk about, but regardless of your feelings, pornography, defined primarily by its intention to arouse, typically doesn't offer the important character context, nuance, or depth possible in a piece of cinematic art. In other words, sexuality often becomes flattened, reduced to mere organs, kind of the way it does when we view sex only scientifically. As Williams puts it, not to speak of sex in the realistic way of which cinema alone is capable is to leave out an enormous chunk of human life. In other words, when we don't actually engage with sexuality in our storytelling, we erase a huge aspect of many people's lived experiences. And put simply, when sex stays hidden, art can get a little boring. Or maybe more importantly, sex negativity festers. And this has a range of consequences, from ensuring young people never learn even the basics of safe sex to encouraging widespread shame that makes people hesitant to speak up about sexual abuse or violence. When it comes down to it, in a lot of our cultures, sex has, since the 80s, been construed as inherently harmful, even violent, especially towards women. While this is based in very real harms, this understanding also erases the positive aspects of the erotic. As filmmaker Walerian Borovchik put it while defending his use of sex on screen, eroticism, sex is one of the most moral parts of life. Eroticism does not kill, exterminate, encourage evil, lead to crime. On the contrary, it makes people gentler, brings joy, gives fulfillment. It leads to selfless pleasure. Americans' fear of pleasure on and off screen then risks denying all of us, and thanks to globalization, much of the world, a level of access to what can be a pretty life-affirming aspect of humanity. But hey, what do you all think? When sex disappears from our movies, do we miss out? If media does shape our understanding of love and sex, do filmmakers have moral obligations when they depict those topics? Or is on-screen sex just a gratuitous indulgence that we could all do without? Let us know what you think in the comments, and let us know some of your favorite films or TV shows that use sex in a tasteful and interesting way. Thank you so much to all of our patrons for supporting our channel. There's nothing sexier to us than you all giving us some of your hard-earned money to help us keep the channel alive and do things that mean a lot to us. If you do join our Patreon, you get free videos with no ads. You get access to our Discord server, extra content, all sorts of stuff that's going to make you feel all types of hot and bothered. But even those of you that are not our patrons, we still love you, maybe not as passionately, but we really appreciate you. So thanks for being here, for watching the videos, for commenting, subscribing, sharing, all that stuff. It really means a lot to us. And until next time, remember, all sex is good except your parents having sex. I'll see you later.